Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Council Chambers here at City Halls for today's Vancouver City Council meeting. It's July the 11th, 2017, and we start by acknowledging we are on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and very thankful for that. And we'll start, Madam Clerk, with the roll call, please.
Mayor Robertson's in the chair. Councillor Louie. Councillor Stevenson. Not in the chamber at the moment. Councillor Deal. Councillor Jang. Here. Councillor Reimer. Councillor Ball. Whoops. Councillor Carr. Here. Councillor Affleck. And Councillor DeGenova. Mr. Mayor, we have a quorum.
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. And we begin this morning with condolences. Sad news a week ago as we remember the passing on June 21st, 2017 of Gwen Barlee, who many of us knew here in Vancouver, a longtime resident of our city, community leader and environmental champion. She was one of the principal leaders of Vancouver's based Wilderness Committee, and in that role for over 15 years, she worked tirelessly and relentlessly to protect BC wilderness and wildlife. She originally came from the South Okanagan, Similkameen, daughter of well-known provincial NDP MLA and BC historian Bill Barlee. She's survived by her mother Kathleen and sisters Diane and Veronica. Gwen is certainly remembered for her compassion for wildlife and her relentless pursuit of federal species at risk protection, and that was achieved, provincial species at risk legislation for BC. As after that, she is certainly respected for her staunch defense of the public good in all the policies she advocated for, and one of those was applying her tenacious research skills to her fight with Lyme disease. Since her diagnosis in the mid-2000s, she worked both locally and nationally, defending the right to accurate diagnosis and treatment for numerous individuals with Lyme disease. She will be greatly missed by her family and many friends here in Vancouver, Wilderness Committee co-workers and people she worked with across BC and Canada and internationally in the defense of nature. So we as a city offer our condolences, our acknowledgement, that contribution that Gwen Barlee made here to our community, to our province and our country. We will miss you, Gwen. From that, we jump into our agenda, and that means meeting in camera later this week. The reasons and authority under the Vancouver Charter are listed in the agenda. Would someone like to move that motion, please? Councillor Louie, a seconder for that. Councillor Jang, all those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. So we'll meet first in camera at the lunch break today. And we're on to the minutes from our past set of meetings. The regular council meeting, June 27th. Any corrections to those minutes? Moved and seconded for adoption. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. Minutes too are from the council meeting that followed the Standing Committee on Policy and Strategic Priorities. Any corrections to those minutes? Mover and seconder, thank you. All those in favor? Any opposed? And that carries. So we've completed our minutes and we are on to the consent agenda items. We have two communications and 4 administrative reports on the agenda for consideration. And we have received a request to speak to Administrative Report 2. So should council wish to hear the speaker, we can refer the report to tomorrow's Standing Committee meeting. Okay, a motion to refer Report 2 to hear speakers. Councillor Deal, a seconder. Councillor Louie, any discussion? All those in favor of referring that report? Any opposed? And that carries. Are there any other reports to be held for debate or questions to staff in the consent agenda? Or does any member wish to hold or declare a conflict of interest on any of the items? Seeing none, Councillor Carr, there you are.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to verify, I know that we don't normally hold report references, but this particular item 1 report reference is for a referral. I just want to make sure we are going to be discussing that. If not, I will hold item 1.
That's a presentation. You're talking about report reference number 1?
Yes. We have the policy report, but it's going to be a presentation. Great. I don't have to worry about it then. Thank you.
Okay. So we can, with the consent agenda, a single motion, we can adopt all of the recommendations. Okay, moved, and Councillor Louis moves, second by Stevenson. And any discussion? All those in favor of the consent agenda, adopting all those recommendations? Any opposed? And that carries, which means we have adopted all of the reports with the exception of A2, which we sent to hear from speakers tomorrow. That means we've adopted the following reports. Communication 1 is the resignation member of council. All the best to Jeff Meggs. And 2 is replacement of a member on the business license chauffeurs permit appeal hearing panels. We've approved the 3 other administrative reports, first being the 2017 Cultural Infrastructure Grant allocations. Thanks to staff and Arts and Culture for all the work on that, all those grants. Good work. So good we didn't need to debate it. And Administrative Report 3, which is 2017 Childcare Enhancement and Other Social Grants. And Administrative Report 4, approval of new sublease agreement for nonprofit operator and approval of lease terms for childcare facility at 1399 Fountain Way, known as the False Creek YMCA Childcare. So those have all been approved now on consent. And that means we are on to our 3 report references today. And the first of those is regulating short-term rentals in Vancouver. There is a related policy report, as Councillor Carr pointed out, and that is a referral of this item to public hearing. So anyone wishing to speak will have that opportunity to be heard in the public hearing. And we have Kay Krishna here, who's our General Manager for Development, Buildings and Licensing, here to present. Ms. Krishna, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, Mayor and Council. I am Kay Krishna, the General Manager of Development, Buildings and Licensing, and I'm here today to present staff's recommendations for legalizing short-term rentals in Vancouver. Catherine Holm, who's the Director of Property Use, Licensing and Animal Services, will present the bulk of the materials this morning, but Catherine and I, our team and other staff from other departments will be here to answer questions. So I'll provide a brief introduction and then I'll pass it on to Catherine to provide an update on our latest analysis and engagement, present our proposed policy framework and implementation approach, and then also discuss proposed next steps. So the purpose of today is to share our final recommendations for a policy framework and an implementation approach that will enable short-term rentals to be legal in Vancouver. And what we're really specifically requesting of Council is to refer our recommendations and policy report for public hearing, likely slated in the fall. So to orient ourselves on where we are in this project and the timeline, in April of 2016, Council requested staff to conduct analysis on the short-term rental market and to look at draft policy frameworks for Vancouver. So staff launched phase 1 of the project and reported back to Council in October 2016. After which Council approved in principle the proposed sort of initial policy framework and requested that staff conduct initial analysis and engagement and formulate final implementation recommendations. So that's what we've done over the past few months, and we're back today to share the work that we've done. We've done initial comparative analysis on cities that have formulated short-term rental policies over the past 6 months. We've conducted initial analysis on concepts that we proposed from phase 1. We've also conducted initial stakeholder engagement, and we've created a detailed implementation plan, including resourcing needs analysis. So we're here today to present that final plan. Following today, upon a public hearing, we will move forward with implementation. You'll see there's initial implementation starting. We need some lead time to kind of get this going, and once it's finalized, we'll refine all of our implementation details, and we're planning to launch in April of next year. So short-term rentals, as we've indicated in the report and in our past presentation to Council, short-term rentals are not currently legal in Vancouver, except for hotels and bed and breakfasts. However, there are almost 6,000 active short-term rental listings in Vancouver at this time. city policies and tools are not well suited or well equipped to support this sort of emerging economy and this emerging market. So for example, zoning, which really helps to separate commercial and residential uses, to reduce transient use in neighborhoods or nuisance in neighborhoods, is slated to kind of protect those things, but also to it defines renters as 30 days and more. So anything less than 30 days or more, according to the zoning and development bylaw, is not legal. And this is a common construct in cities across North America. Also, things like enforcement tools are typically complaint-based and are inspection-based. It's very difficult to do an inspection and really confirm a short-term rental. So we need to really think differently about our policies and tools to enable this framework. And it's really important to create a legal framework for this emerging market. With over almost 6,000 short-term rentals today, it's really important for us to ensure the health and safety of both the residents of the city, but also visitors who are coming and using short-term rentals. It's important for us to create an even regulatory playing field for things like taxes, licensing fees, and other things. And it's really important for us to protect the people who want to live and work in Vancouver, but who are really struggling to do so because of limited accessibility and affordability of housing. So for that reason, we're bringing forward this proposed approach. And as we've seen, cities around the world are really struggling with how to approach short-term rentals in this emerging market. We've seen a range of policies from global cities, especially what I would compare high-cost, high-demand cities across the world. And there's been a range of policy frameworks from very permissive to very restrictive. And we're kind of seeing more and more cities, especially as they roll out policies or they evolve their policies, coming more toward the middle. So not so much on as permissive or restrictive, but really a balanced approach. And that's really what we're here to propose today. We have the advantage of learning from a lot of these cities, but we're still on the front end of this emerging market. There are a lot of cities who have yet to propose policies around this. So from what we've learned from other cities and the work that we've done in looking at our local market and engaging with a diverse group of stakeholders from across the city, we're proposing what we believe is a balanced approach. That we will legalize short-term rentals, and the approach that we're proposing, we think, will legalize 70 to 80% of those short-term rentals that are in existence today. And we're really hopeful that this really works to enable short-term rentals in a way that strikes a balance between both the pros and the cons of the short-term rental market, which Catherine will get into in more detail. And one thing I'd like to note is that as this is the initial rollout of a new complex policy framework and program, we fully anticipate that we'll learn from it ourselves, just as other cities have learned and we've learned from other cities. And so we propose in about a year from implementation that we will come back and report to council and share our lessons learned, the outcomes of the policies, and likely an evolution of the policy and the framework once we've actually hit the ground running with it. One other thing I'd like to note is that the short-term rental project and these proposals really sit within a suite of housing-related initiatives that staff are pursuing in the city. And these are separate but related initiatives, and I think it's important to note that we're aligning across project teams and staff, but that we're also handling each of these individually as reports back to council. So first, the housing strategy. That will be coming forward with an update in 2 weeks at the next council session, so there will be much more detail on that. But we've done a lot of integration with that team, particularly around ongoing conversations and the robust public engagement that's taking place through the fall and the end of the year for the housing reset, which will go deeper into some of the topics around housing forms and types, including short-term rentals, but much broader as well. So that may create opportunities for us to hear from that public feedback, and the strategy itself may inform kind of an evolution of what we're proposing today. Also, for secondary suites, there's been a lot of conversation about the relationship of secondary suites to this policy. Secondary suites are one of many types of housing types that are considered for short-term rentals. There's a lot of work already going on with the city related to secondary suites. So one is looking at ways to expand opportunities to build new and additional types of secondary suites in certain zones. And then a second piece of work is looking at how we can improve compliance around already legal secondary suites. As we know, the compliance rate is quite low today. So those are separate but related. And then the last two, one is the empty homes tax, which you've received quite a bit of information about. From our perspective, it's important to align how the short-term rental and empty homes tax relate to each other from a policy and implementation perspective, but also the rollout, the timing, and the communications around those two things. We want to make sure that they're lined up and create minimal confusion to the public. And then finally, we're in the process of doing a full business license review. And short-term rentals, as we're proposing it, would be a business licensing-based program. And so the short-term rentals, long-term rentals, hotels, other things will be part of that review. We don't anticipate a significant change in what we're proposing today because we're aligning our approach for short-term rentals to the larger business license review. But as we go forward with that, we might find some need to adapt and change based on that review. So with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Catherine Holm to really share an update on the work that we've been doing over the past 6 months, and then review our detailed approach to the policy framework and implementation for short-term rentals in Vancouver.
Thanks, Kay. Hi, I'm Catherine Holm, as noted, Director of Licensing, Property Use Inspections, and Animal Services here at the city. So as noted, I'm going to walk through the analysis and engagement work that we've done over the last several months. Kay spoke to this, but just want to clarify, we do have this spectrum that exists from permissive to restrictive. Cities around the world are continuing to develop and evolve their approach to how they're regulating short-term rentals. And staff have seen that this spectrum exists where municipalities fall, varying from permissive to restrictive. While some cities have adopted no restrictions to short-term rentals, others have adopted an entirely prohibitive approach. And most municipalities are landing somewhere in the middle, with factors considered such as principal residence, a license or a registry, and a cap on nightly rentals. And we're seeing as new cities are coming online, like Toronto, they are landing in the middle of the spectrum. And those cities who started at one end of the spectrum are slowly migrating to the middle as well as they review their policies. So in April 2017, Host Compliance, a third-party contractor we worked with, conducted another data scrape of online platforms advertising short-term rentals. We saw that the market is continuing to grow, the number of units increasing by 10% since last June, though growing at a much slower pace than previous years, where Vancouver experienced 80% plus growth annually. The number of operators has also continued to grow by approximately 10% in the same time period. The number of operators with greater than 10 listings, though, has been reduced in half, which is encouraging as the city has undertaken efforts to reduce the number of multiple listing operators during this same time period. We've also learned that this is a transient business as an operator. 72% of the operators with short-term rentals in April were not doing so in June of 2016. And high operator turnover may be attributed to the challenges and workload associated with managing a short-term rental business. So this picture illustrates where short-term rentals are occurring based on the April 2017 data collected. We're seeing the highest concentration of short-term rentals in downtown, and the next highest are in Mount Pleasant, Renfrew, Kitsilano, Point Grey, and East Hastings. There are more entire units advertised downtown and more private or shared rooms advertised in the residential neighborhoods. And between June 2016 and April 2017, Marpole, Southeast Vancouver, Westside Kerrisdale have all experienced a 30% plus growth. So the complete findings from Host Compliance are found in an appendix of the report, but I wanted to flag a few particular data points about the current short-term rental market in Vancouver. This recent data scrape illustrated that the online short-term rental market continues to be dominated by Airbnb at 82%, followed by the HomeAway family with Expedia at 9%. 72% of the listings were for an entire unit, while 25% were for a private room, and more than half the listings were for one-bedroom accommodations. Our examination of the Vancouver market focused on the potential impact of short-term rentals on the long-term rental housing supply, which is currently very low. The rapid growth of the short-term rental market is happening at the same time as Vancouver continues to experience a housing crisis, and people who live and work in Vancouver are struggling to find affordable rental housing. The rental vacancy rate continues to remain under 1%, well under the targeted rental vacancy rate of 3%. In fact, Vancouver has the lowest vacancy rate and the highest rent of any major city in Canada. At the same time, it's acknowledged that there is a strong financial incentive to rent a property short-term. Analysis estimates that the revenue for a short-term rental of a one-bedroom unit for 9 to 12 days a month generates the same gross revenue as renting the property on the long-term rental market. After factoring in transaction costs, it's estimated that a short-term rental unit will generate 200 to 300% more net income than a long-term rental unit. And this strong financial incentive poses risk to the stability of the long-term rental market. It's fragile and at risk of being diverted to short-term rentals if the market is not regulated. And though there's limited data available to estimate the number of non-principal residents currently advertised on short-term rental platforms, using data provided by Airbnb, 27% of units are listed for more than 90 days a year. Assuming that most residents are unlikely to be able to short-term rent their entire home for 90 days a year, if it is their principal residence, this means that over 1,000 entire dwelling units listed on Airbnb are likely non-principal residents. Staff believe these residents have the potential to be returned or added to the long-term rental market and can continue to generate revenue for owners. Council had asked us to explore this further in October to examine if there was an opportunity to tax revenue generated by short-term rentals, and specifically to explore a hotel or a business tax. And this was partly in response to requests from the hotel industry requesting parity with the current municipal and regional district tax, also known as the MRDT, which is a 3% tax applied by the provincial government to hotel transactions. These funds are collected by the province and used to promote tourism. Staff have confirmed that PST only currently applies if an operator has 4 or more units, and GST is only applied if revenue is greater than $30,000 annually. Staff have confirmed that the extension of the MRDT to short-term rentals will require a change by the provincial government and is outside of city jurisdiction. Staff explored the option of applying a business tax within the city and confirmed the city does not have jurisdiction to apply a business tax to short-term rental activities. And staff learned that many hotels in Vancouver have voluntarily agreed to create and collect a 1.5% destination marketing fee that is also dedicated to promoting tourism. We've also spent some time looking at secondary suites in more detail. We acknowledge that secondary suites are an important part of the Vancouver long-term rental market. The most recent census estimated that there are approximately 30,000 secondary suites in Vancouver. Currently, the city has 2,210 active business licenses issued for long-term rentals in secondary suites, although it's acknowledged that many more secondary suites are being used as long-term rental units. There's work underway, as Kay referenced, to expand the type of secondary suites and to increase the number of legal registered suites. Staff have met with hosts who rent their secondary suites on the short-term rental market. We heard that renting the secondary suite was highly profitable and contributed to the affordability of home ownership. We also heard that many hosts were not willing to rent their secondary suite on the long-term rental market for personal reasons for stays of 30 days or longer. There was also strong feedback from consultation that secondary suites are critical to Vancouver's long-term rental market, and any short-term rental policy should not enable even more secondary suites to be shifted to the short-term rental market that are currently in place, particularly given the favorable economics that I spoke to earlier. Although some of the existing operators may not be willing to rent their secondary suite on the long-term market, staff recommend that the risk to the rental market of exposing all secondary suites to a potential shift to short-term rentals is too great. The focus remains on enabling long-term rental availability for those who want to live and work in Vancouver. Staff also considered that by allowing owners and renters to conduct short-term rental businesses in their principal residence would provide an equitable opportunity to owners and renters alike to obtain a license under a consistent framework. And allowing some homeowners the opportunity to conduct additional short-term rentals in a secondary suite or investment property would create a lack of parity and consistency in policy application. Now, another part of our ongoing analysis and engagement was to focus on engaging our key stakeholders. Over the last several months, we've been in conversation with various stakeholders to gather additional perspectives to inform the policy framework development. We consulted with representatives from each of the stakeholder groups on the slide. And through those conversations, we heard a diversity of opinion on the impact of short-term rentals and how they should be permitted and prohibited. Each stakeholder group has an interest in developing appropriate regulations and also in ensuring compliance and the overall success of the policy over time. There were several difficult trade-offs that emerged. The balance between ensuring policy does not negatively impact housing supply against allowing owners and renters the opportunity to generate additional income. The balance between ensuring good neighborhood behavior and minimal impact on community, while also acknowledging that short-term rentals support local business activity in non-tourist areas. And the balance between providing equity across transient accommodation operators, including hotels, bed and breakfasts, and short-term rentals, while also highlighting the challenges of compliance and enforcement with short-term rental operators. As a reminder, in 2016, staff conducted a Talk Vancouver survey to gather public feedback on short-term rentals, and I'll walk through a few of the key findings. When asked about general perceptions, most agreed with the statement that they believe the short-term rentals make it harder for people to find quality, affordable housing for long-term rental accommodation. And the second most agreed upon statement was that short-term rentals make Vancouver a more appealing tourist destination. When asked about priorities for short-term rentals, the most agreed upon statement was that the city should protect the supply of affordable rental housing, followed by keeping residential areas and buildings safe and quiet. And finally, when asked who should be allowed to offer units on the short-term rental market, the most agreed upon statements were that it should be homeowners and renters, respectively, in their primary residence. Now, these findings have informed the development of our guiding principles, which were brought forward to Council in 2016 and continue to apply to the proposed framework discussed today. So that wraps up the summary of our analysis and engagement to date. And now I'd like to speak to our proposed approach with the policy framework and implementation plan. So these were the guiding principles presented in October of 2016, and these remain the guiding principles for the proposed framework. Research, comparative analysis, and stakeholder feedback have informed these guiding principles and have shaped the policy and program recommendations. And staff have maintained a key focus on the first guiding principle, which is to protect the long-term rental supply in Vancouver. This is similar to the graph I showed earlier. Again, staff have reviewed the various policy options from various jurisdictions and believe the recommendations for Vancouver represent a balanced approach. It's acknowledged that a restrictive approach, like that in Vancouver at the moment, which prohibits all short-term rentals, is not effective, while removing all restrictions would likely impact the availability of much-needed existing long-term rental stock. Almost all municipalities have either not implemented or removed a night cap, which limits the number of nights which a unit can be short-term rented. As in the October 2016 report to Council, staff are recommending that Vancouver not implement a cap. As only principal residents are eligible, it will serve as an inherent cap for the owner or renter of the principal residence. So the proposed policy framework is as follows. Business licenses would only be granted to principal residents, and secondary residents would not be eligible for a short-term rental business license, even if the empty homes tax is paid. Secondary suites or laneway houses that are occupied as a principal residence will be eligible for a short-term rental business license. They are not restricted from participating in the framework so long as they meet the criteria of serving as a principal residence and a legal dwelling unit. Owners and renters will be eligible to apply for a license for their principal residence, and renters will, of course, require landlord permission in their rental agreement. Owners and renters will be required to comply with strata bylaws as applicable. Operators would be required to obtain this business license through the city and pay an annual license fee, similar to the approximately 50,000 other business licenses issued in the city annually. We are recommending this licensing approach after reviewing other municipalities, many of which have implemented a similar registry or a similar mechanism that acknowledges that these are small local business operators in buildings and neighborhoods not originally designed or intended for business activity. Operators will be required to post their valid business license number in all listings on online platforms, similar to what's done in other municipalities. Business license applicants would be asked to make several self-declarations during the online application process, and licenses will only be granted if requirements are met. And this includes confirmation that it is the applicant's principal residence, that it's a legal dwelling unit, for example, not a motor vehicle or a boat, and that the unit meets building and fire code requirements. It also will require that the operator will abide by good neighborly behavior. And a draft of the proposed online self-declaration checklist is also an appendix in the report. So these are a few scenarios. These diagrams are intended to illustrate where short-term rentals would be permitted under the proposed framework. In scenario A, if the secondary suite and laneway house are not occupied by a principal resident or a long-term renter, then they cannot be rented short-term. In scenario B, if the secondary suite and laneway house are occupied by long-term renters and are their principal residents, then they can be rented short-term with landlord approval. And in scenario C, the suite that serves as a principal residence can be rented short-term, while the secondary home or investment property cannot. I'll walk through a few specific scenarios based on some feedback we've heard of where we think this will occur. First, this scenario represents a couple who are interested in renting out spare bedrooms in their home, in their principal residence. And under our proposed framework, this scenario would be supported, and the couple would be able to conduct short-term rentals upon receiving a business license. In this scenario, Marissa is renting her apartment, her principal residence, on Airbnb, but does not have explicit permission from her landlord in her tenancy agreement. Even though she has met the test of short-term renting her principal residence, she will need to work with her landlord to confirm she has permission to conduct short-term rentals and update her tenancy agreement accordingly. In this scenario, a couple has built a laneway home for family and friends when visiting town. They would like to conduct short-term rentals in the home when not used by friends and family. Since the laneway home does not serve as a principal residence, it would not be eligible to be licensed as a short-term rental accommodation. They could rent the laneway home for 30 days or more as a long-term rental accommodation. And finally, this scenario has an individual with an investment property in Vancouver and would like to conduct short-term rentals when not in town. Since this is not his principal residence, he is not eligible. In addition, the unit must be rented a minimum of 6 months a year to a long-term rental tenant to avoid paying the empty homes tax. So as presented in the proposed policy framework, as short-term rentals represent owners and renters running a business from their home, staff are proposing to establish a new business license for short-term rental operators in accordance with the city's existing business licensing approach. Upon review of various policy approaches in other municipalities around the world, and in discussion with various stakeholders, staff are recommending that licensing fees be set at a level that they do not pose a restriction or a barrier to compliance. Staff are recommending an annual fee of $49, which is aligned with the current annual fees for long-term rental licenses and bed and breakfast licenses. As with all business licenses, new applicants will be required to pay a one-time $54 application fee in the first year. Staff expect to undertake a citywide business license fee review in the next year, and the short-term rental license fee would be included in that review process. As with existing business licenses, should the conditions of the license be violated, and the operator would be subject to enforcement actions and potential license suspension or recommendation for revocation. And as business license holders, the name of the licensee would be posted publicly, though the address of the short-term rental operation would not, to address safety concerns by operators. Through our analysis, staff have confirmed that the city is unable to tax as originally suggested. Rather, the proposal is to implement a transaction fee applicable to all short-term rental bookings and set at a percentage of up to 3%. The fee would be collected and remitted by the online platforms, ideally. Some platforms, such as Airbnb, are already collecting and remitting similar funds in other municipalities. Funds collected would be used to cover the operating costs of the short-term rental program. Staff are recommending this approach as it is a cost borne by the guest, not the platform or the operator. Staff recommend that the provincial government review their current tax regulations as they apply to transient accommodations and consider creating tax equity among hotels, bed and breakfasts, and short-term rentals. And staff are also recommending that the federal and provincial governments take necessary steps to ensure that short-term rental operators are compliant with existing tax requirements. As short-term rentals serve as transient accommodation, and building and fire codes require additional safety measures to be in place due to guests' inherent lack of familiarity with their surroundings. As a result, staff are recommending enhanced building safety requirements for those dwelling units used as short-term rentals. Business license applicants will be required to confirm these requirements are in place during the self-declarations in the online application process. Operators must agree to provide the following if they intend to use their principal residence for a short-term rental. And that includes a fire safety and egress plan posted by all exits, working and accessible fire extinguishers on every floor, working and accessible carbon monoxide detectors on each floor if a gas appliance is present, a contact person who will be available 24/7 during the rental duration, interconnected smoke detectors in all sleeping rooms and on every floor. And if the short-term rental unit is adjoined to other dwelling units, there will need to be an automated sprinkler system or fire separation between units within 5 years by January 1st, 2023. In addition, operators will need to comply with good neighborhood requirements, such as ensuring neighborhood parking is not impacted by members of the community, is not impacted by short-term rentals for members of the community, that strata permission and alignment with existing strata bylaws are in place, that landlord permission is in place, and that the tenancy agreement reflects the requirements with short-term rentals, and obtaining appropriate insurance coverage for short-term rental activity. All short-term rental units would be subject to audits and inspections to ensure compliance with these requirements, and these again are outlined in the self-declaration checklist provided in the appendix of the report. So I'd now like to talk a bit about the proposed compliance and enforcement framework. And the proposed framework for compliance and enforcement was based on several guiding principles. And it, first and foremost, was to bring the short-term rental market and the industry into a regulatory framework, and to ensure that the principal residence unit requirement was met in order to protect the long-term rental market. While this graphic illustrates the city's approach to monitoring and executing on compliance and enforcement matters, it's important to note that there are several partners in the enforcement ecosystem with respect to short-term rentals. Many stakeholders will need to play a part in ensuring compliance and delivering on enforcement. This includes community members, letting neighbors know of any negative experiences resulting from short-term rentals. Landlords are encouraged to communicate with long-term tenants regarding their level of support for short-term rentals and to include specific reference in their tenancy agreements. Strata councils are encouraged to dialogue with members to develop the best approach to short-term rentals for their building and for their community, and to communicate that approach to their owners and renters. Online platforms like Airbnb and Expedia are encouraged to communicate Vancouver's regulatory requirements to its operators and to take steps to suspend accounts if there is non-compliant activity. Housing advocates are encouraged to work with landlords, tenants, and other stakeholders to understand the impact of short-term rentals and to advise the city regarding options to improve the regulatory framework. And tourism agencies are encouraged to promote compliant short-term rental operators as an accommodation option to further Vancouver's appeal as a tourist destination. The city encourages all stakeholders to let the city know if there is evidence of suspected non-compliant behavior. So under the proposed compliance framework, staff would gather information on non-compliant short-term rental operators through various sources, including community complaints, data from online platforms, data screen scraping by a third party, and internal data sets such as the empty homes tax data, and also previously reported non-compliant operators. Staff would review the information received and prioritize based on the nature of the operator and the offense. And depending on the circumstance, additional information may be gathered and a site inspection may occur. Should staff determine that non-compliance is resulting in the removal of units from the long-term rental market as they are not principal residents, or creating a disruption to the neighborhood, or a safety hazard, or some other issue, the case will be either issued a municipal ticket information, a ticket of $1,000 per violation, or sent to the city prosecutor's office for review. And this step may lead to prosecution or filing of an injunction with the provincial court. All licensed operators would be subject to an audit, which would randomly select licensed operators and review for compliance with the self-declarations made upon licensing. License holders would be asked to provide documentation to support the declarations made during the license application process, such as evidence that it is their principal residence and that they have strata bylaws supporting short-term rental activity. Should the audit determine that the self-declarations were not truthful and cannot be adequately explained by the license holder, the business license is subject to revocation review, and the ability to obtain a business license going forward may be limited or restricted. Access to the unit may be required as part of the audit and inspection cycle, following a risk-based approach for prioritization of action. So compliance and enforcement efforts will be managed along several different enforcement pathways, depending on the situation. And staff are proposing to apply a prioritization framework for compliance and enforcement as follows. Our Tier 1 or our Priority 1 will continue to be focused on commercial operators who are operating multiple short-term rentals outside of the regulatory framework. They are either unlicensed or licensed through misrepresentation. And these operators are considered the most egregious and will be forwarded directly to our legal department for review of options, including filing an injunction and or prosecution within the provincial court system. Tier 2 will focus on operators who are not licensed and are operating short-term rentals from their principal or non-principal residence. Conversations to date with the major online platforms such as Airbnb and Expedia have indicated that they will be supportive of removing operators from their platforms who do not comply with local regulatory requirements. These unlicensed operators will also be identified through community complaints. Staff will attempt to contact the unlicensed operator to educate on the process and to provide an opportunity for compliance. Upon collection of sufficient evidence and unsuccessful compliance efforts, staff will pursue legal options, including issuance of a municipal ticket information of $1,000 per violation or referral to the prosecutor's office to file an injunction and or prosecution. And finally, Tier 3 will focus on licensed operators who are violating their good neighbor agreements and creating challenges for the community with nuisance complaints such as noise, garbage, or parking issues. Staff will attempt to contact the operators to advise of the complaints and to provide an opportunity to correct the behavior and come into compliance with the terms of their business license. Should this be unsuccessful, audit and inspection actions may follow, along with ticketing and or a recommendation to revoke the business license. And should the activity persist following that action, the operator will then be treated as an unlicensed operator and subject to the Tier 2 enforcement pathway. At the current time, as noted, short-term rentals continue to be prohibited in Vancouver under our current bylaws, and staff are continuing to pursue enforcement action with large-scale commercial operators and those operators who are presenting an unsafe condition or a nuisance condition. Issues have been brought to staff's attention through community complaints, mostly through 311 and the media, and through proactive efforts with platforms. And where compliance has not been achieved, the city has pursued prosecution and issued municipal ticket informations. With respect to the anticipated costs of the program over time, staff have modeled the expected costs based on assumptions around revenue generated through compliance and operational expenses. Through increased compliance with the licensing requirements, additional revenue generated could serve to offset the costs of the program management, though we may not move to a full cost recovery model in the foreseeable future. Staff have remained conservative in compliance rate estimates and cost modeling and will reassess upon program launch and availability of data with respect to compliance and the subsequent revenues, and may need to adjust the program revenue and expenses accordingly. Establishing and administering a program to oversee the short-term rental framework for licensing, compliance, and enforcement will require initial one-time funding and incur ongoing operating expenses. Maintaining an accessible licensing fee of $49 impacts revenue projections, though additional revenue would be earned with the transaction fee, offsetting program operating expenses. By reducing program expenses over a few years of establishing and stabilizing the program, the net cost will be reduced and potentially further offset through increased compliance and or increased license fees. The estimated 2017 implementation costs would be funded from the approved 2017 operating budget, and staff proposed that the 2018 implementation and ongoing operating expenses be requested through the 2018 budgeting process. So finally on our agenda, we'll present our proposed next steps to advance the proposed policy framework. Today we are recommending a referral to public hearing to be held this fall. And upon approval, staff proposed commencing implementation activities such as developing business documentation and training materials, public communication materials, and licensing information, and the onboarding of staff. And program launch is recommended for April of 2018. What we've presented today represents a balanced approach to regulating short-term rentals, adhering to our guiding principles, and aligned with the learnings from cities around the world who are all adapting to this newly emerged industry. Through analysis and consultation, staff believe that the proposed policy framework and compliance and enforcement strategy will allow us to better manage and understand the short-term rental business activities that are taking place in Vancouver. Thank you, and we are happy to take your questions.
Okay, thank you very much for all the work that's gone into this and that very comprehensive presentation. Coming back to council with that, and we have questions here and also a motion to refer this to hear speakers. That is before council as well. It's not moved yet, but that is what is referral to, sorry, public, it has a referral to public hearing. What did I say? Motion? Yeah, I said the council will have to refer this to public hearing in order to hear speakers. That's the program here. Councillor Stevenson is first with questions.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor. And when I have the opportunity, in fact, I would like to make a motion to refer this to public hearing. Thank you, staff, for this very comprehensive report. It's a report that, as you say, is trying to balance both the need for long-term rentals, which we have a crisis in Vancouver with less than 1%, and it's increasingly difficult for people to find rental accommodation. And then on the other hand, the need for short-term rentals and the desire for people indeed to rent out their accommodation. And it is a booming market with tourism. And so it really is necessary for us to come up with regulations, and I think we've gone a long way to deal with this. But as you say, it's very, very complex, and I'm sure there's going to be many questions in regards to this today. I'd like to just start to ask about the problem that we've had with people who rent secondary suites and being evicted, and the cause of that, and why that's so important for us to look at regulations in regards to this issue.
Thank you, Councillor. So the question that you're asking is what we've heard around people being evicted.
Yes.
Yeah, we've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence. We don't have data on that sort of thing, both from people within communities and renters themselves about some being evicted with the understanding that then their units are put on the short-term rental market. Why and the rationale is unclear. So sometimes maybe people have a reason for doing that in the near term with an intent to go back to the long term, but we have heard stories about that. We've also heard about, we know and we've identified through our enforcement and complaints of, say, large multifamily rental buildings that are actually advertising all of their units as short-term potential units, which is a big problem from our point of view. So we've heard a lot of different stories, but we don't have a lot of facts.
Okay. In regards to the enforcement, you went through a great deal of what you're proposing. What would you highlight as new enforcement regulations? Because as we know, things have been rather lax and we haven't been able to enforce very well. So how are we going to change that so that this becomes effective?
I'll highlight a few things and staff can jump in. So, so for one thing, enforcement is often complaint-based and also inspection-based. But when inspectors go to a short-term rental or an apartment, it's very difficult to know if it's a short-term rental or a long-term rental or just someone's home, unless there are tourism materials and suitcases and, it's hard to know, or that could just be an out-of-town visitor. So it's very hard to do a inspection-based enforcement model. And it's also hard with complaints. If we get a complaint, a neighbor could say, hey, the building next door, we think there are short-term rentals, but if you don't know the unit, you don't have more information, it's really hard to confirm. So we're doing a couple new things. One is gathering data online from a lot of different sources to proactively identify and validate information, which you need in a court of law to actually do prosecutions. So Catherine highlighted a couple of the ways we're gathering data and doing cross-checking against our business licensing. We're also requiring that short-term rental hosts put their business license within their online advertisement so that we can validate that. That creates a real check and balance for us, that we can validate it, that it's accurate, and then we can enforce against invalid numbers. And then we're also creating a new position. So instead of adding more inspectors, we're creating a new position called a enforcement coordinator, and that person will serve almost like a brain and a conductor for what we need to do. So they'll help to gather the information, evaluate it, and then determine a path of enforcement based on data. So that's a new approach to than just sending out an inspector. So there are a number of things that we're putting in place to be much more holistic and comprehensive, data-driven and proactive for our enforcement.
Mr. Mayor, I don't know how much time I've got left.
10 seconds.
10 seconds, it's over.
It's
Thank
over.
you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Stevenson. Councillor Affleck.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a few questions regarding one of the things that was said. I'm not sure which one. It was about this being a transient business. And I'm wondering, and then it's likely people are giving up, I think was stated. They get in, then they leave. So what does that mean as far as keeping track of it? And then the possibility that what the problem, that they're realizing this is something that they're not into, and they get out of it. So just wondering why, the whole transient, and then therefore who knows how many licensing, and then if they're getting out of it, then is it a problem? Why are we?
Right. So we have talked to some other municipalities too and understood this is actually a pattern that exists elsewhere as well. It's not unique to Vancouver, where there is a lot of turnover on the operator side. So we expect that to continue as it is shown in other municipalities as well. From our perspective, from a licensing point of view, it will mean keeping track of many more licenses because we do expect turnover and closure and perhaps reopening of licenses. We just accepted that's a course of doing business.
For those people who decide to get out of it, they get in it, they go, not for me. Do they go and they put their homes back into the long-term rental pool?
To be determined. I mean, that's really what we're hoping would happen.
Currently, though, I mean, is that what's happening? Are they
Currently,
saying, what? I can't be bothered. I'll just put this back in the long-term rental.
Right. We're not sure. We're not sure if those are happening in units that are being returned to the long-term rental market or not.
So perhaps they're romanticizing all the money they're going to make, and then they find out it's a headache, and they don't make as much money, so therefore it's better to have a predictable rent in a long-term rental for their, whatever it be, a secondary suite or whatever.
We have heard that anecdotal evidence, yeah.
One of the things it says in the report, also on page 7, it talks about that the numbers are stabilizing, that we're seeing that here and in other markets as well. So that begs the question, why do anything? Why create all this bureaucracy and spend all this money and have this sort of state where we're having people potentially misinform us or we're having neighbors spying on each other? Why even do this if we're seeing a stabilization in the market?
Well, it's currently an unregulated market, and so there are
sorry, we have regulations currently. We have the 30-day rule.
Right, but it's 6,000 are happening independent of that rule being in place, and
but is that because enforcement's not happening, or?
It's really hard to enforce. I think this is the nature of sort of the online sharing economy and how it's emerged, and this is what part of the challenge that cities across the world are facing today, that rules such as the zoning rules, which are pretty consistent across most large cities for not renting a residential unit for less than 30 days. That's a pretty common zoning rule that kind of flies in the face of new and growing markets like short-term rentals. So something like the stats we showed that Airbnb or that all of the short-term platforms have grown exponentially over the past few years, and now it's becoming more normalized. But if we have 6,000 units that are being rented in the short term, but they don't have visibility around health and safety, they don't have terms around compliance, we don't have a legal framework for how people live and operate in them, it's both for tenants and residents of the city, but also for visitors. We just create quite a deal of risk, a great deal of risk for not having any visibility into this market today.
Sure. I mean, there's two parts of the report. There's that, and then there's the whole restricting and spying and all those things that we're doing. One of the things that perhaps is we've had a challenge with is the marijuana stores, and we created a very expensive licensing fee. So far, we've had some success, not a lot. But did we look at saying, instead of creating restrictions, if people are renting their places for 99 days a month, is what we heard from Airbnb, it's 90 days a year. Why not, and then those rest of the days, we don't know what they're doing. They might be having a family. Why not just create a really high, more expensive license, charge a lot of money? If you take it 10 times, then our revenue could be $5-6 million a year in revenue from licensing that could be then put into into homes and housing in the city. Why did we not look at that as a potential as opposed to creating this sort of stick approach?
Sure. I mean, we would love to collect more revenue on this and recover and contribute those funds to affordable housing programs. But the challenge we've seen from other cities, and we anticipate, and as we've seen with our own secondary suite programs, is lack of compliance. And some of the feedback we've heard from some of those things are the perceived cost of compliance and coming into a legal framework. So because this is new and because there are already 6,000 illegal short-term renters out there now, we wanted to create a very low barrier to get as many people into compliance as possible. We also did a comparison for the other license fees for bed and breakfast and long-term rental license fees, which are kind of in the equivalency range, and they were around the same. That's a kind of the current rate for those license fees. So we wanted to create it kind of in that range. So our rationale was to normalize it with the other business license fees that are comparable.
Okay, that's your time. Thanks, Councillor Affleck. Councillor DiGenova.
And other stakeholders. Did they endorse this report that's before us today and the recommendations? I can ask those questions of them after it goes to public hearing if it is indeed referred. So I'd like to ask that of staff today. Are they fully supportive of the recommendations and endorsing the report?
Well, I can't fully speak on their behalf either, but I can talk about the conversations that we've had. And we've met with Airbnb quite extensively over the past few months, both as phase one and during phase two. We have a very good partnership with them, and they've been clear about their boundaries and interests from the beginning. And as we've explored and sort of furthered our analysis, we've had a very good back and forth with Airbnb. We've only started, we've had a number of conversations with Expedia, who's the kind of the second largest in the market and has a bunch of the platforms combined. They're more emergent in the market, but they haven't been as cooperative or as engaged with us, but they've been newer to that conversation. So then the rest of the platforms we haven't heard from. So Airbnb represents kind of the largest and the most engaged platform partner. Overall, Airbnb, I understand, believes that homeowners should be allowed to rent their secondary suites or secondary units, whether that's a laneway or a secondary suite. So they don't agree with that.
Okay, so
and I think that that's their principal dispute with the report. But most of the other components of it, I think that they support.
Okay, that's good to know. Another question that I had is regarding sort of looking at the different scenarios, and thank you, that's very helpful. But someone who has a secondary suite in their home, what makes a secondary suite a suite is really a stove. So if they were to remove that stove and have a hot plate or something like that, could they then say that that suite was a part of their home and be renting that secondary suite out? I mean, are there loopholes here? I have to ask that question first, and then just in case I don't get my other question in, my other question would be regarding sort of the, well, I'll ask that first, and if you can just understand, I have one more question.
Sure. So I think, as I said, this is our out of the gate proposal for a fairly complex program and putting a whole new compliance framework in place for something that hasn't existed. So we fully anticipate that we will learn from this, as other cities have. They put out proposals, they've implemented them, and then they've evolved them. And as Catherine mentioned, they're all kind of moving toward the middle of the proposal framework, which is where we're landing too. So Toronto's kind of in the same place as we are. Sure, I think that there will be ways that some people can work around this, and we'll try to game the system, if you will. But I also think by requiring a business license in the posting, by looking at the compliance and the information we already have about registered secondary suites, if they're legal, we can see that they've actually taken them off of the registry. So there are ways that we can do audits around the data. Also, there are only 7% of the secondary suites in the city today are even compliant. So our bigger problem is actually compliance of existing secondary suites and trying to get them into a kind of a compliance program.
Now, we have a very strict public hearing process. I know that staff understand that and counselors understand that. I was a little taken aback to see the mayor and staff holding a press conference to announce what these regulations would mean and the concerns that led to these regulations before a proper public hearing process. I don't usually see that with many development applications. Can you elaborate on that? And does that in any way compromise the integrity of the public hearing process?
I don't think that it will or should compromise the integrity. I mean, the public hearing process is open for the public to come and speak. So it's a fairly, it's a structured and open process, as you say. I think part of the idea on the press was because we've heard a lot of misinformation in the press. And so the day the report came out, we wanted to help explain what the proposal would be.
And one last question, and that's regarding the licensing fees. Is the first licensing fee refundable if they're not successful in renting their suite, or I suppose a room in their house, or would they be told you instead have to turn this into a secondary suite instead of it having a hot plate and being a portion of your house? I suppose that's a question that I was also asked.
Okay. We are not dictating whether or not how they would convert a suite or not. And it's really for any business license, if someone's business isn't successful, they don't get their business license fee back. I mean, that's just not a standard. That's not how we operate. So the success of someone's business doesn't determine whether or not they pay license fees or get them returned.
Okay,
time is up. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Carr is next.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Mayor. Thank you so much. I know there's been an incredible amount of work on this, and I really appreciate all the detail. My first question has to do with two different statistics that I got in your presentation, and I just want some confirmation of which is which. One statistic was that you expect basically 20 to 30% of short-term rentals to be not legalized. I think you said you expect 70 to 80% to be legalized. That was your statement. But then later on, you said that you expect a 25% compliance and optimistically 40%. I didn't quite understand the difference between compliance and legalized and why there's a big gap there.
Great questions. Thank you for paying attention to all the details. So I think from the legalized, what we're suggesting is that if we put this proposed approach in place, that of the 6,000 short-term rentals today, this proposed framework would allow or legalize 70 to 80% of them. Now, whether someone then chooses to actually apply for a business license, follow the rules, sign the good neighbor agreement, get approvals from their strata, is more of the compliance and uptake piece. Right. So we're creating a framework that allows 70 to 80%. The 20 to 30% that we don't think will be allowed will be the commercial operators, people renting their secondary, like second homes or second investment properties, those kind of things. That's what we think will not fall in line.
Okay.
And then the compliance piece, the reason we selected, we tried to be conservative with that uptake. If we assumed 100% compliance, this would be a fully cost recovered program, but we don't think that's realistic. And we've looked at other cities. So the highest compliance we've seen, I think, was in, I forget which city, but they had Denver is 40%, but no other city we've seen has had that amount. And then San Francisco has around 24% today. They started at only 4% and they've shifted and improved to 24. So we decided to, for estimating and budgeting purposes, to err on the side of the conservative for compliance.
As you know, I've sent you a number of questions, so I'll get through as many as I can, and hopefully you can answer the rest at public hearing. And one of the things that you could also answer is what we do about the non-compliance, if it's 60% or if it's 75%. I'd like to just be able to have the public know and us know as councillors what the plan is. That's a fairly low level of compliance. There's some other questions I have around data, and it will help me to be able to decide about this program. And so I want to know, and again, this will, you can provide it at public hearing, but if we know and if we have data on how many of the about 6,000 short-term rentals are secondary suites or laneway, if there's any way we can know that or do know any of that information, because this is, you don't need to necessarily, I mean, maybe I should. How much time do I have? I only have 2 minutes. Let me run through a few questions in it, because these are sort of grouped, right? Another is the info on if we know anything about how many are actually illegal. And I'm assuming when you use the term illegal, most of those would probably would be secondary suites, but maybe not. So again, so what kind of data we have on that? Like, is this a huge problem or is this not such a big problem in terms of, in general, even our whole housing? I also would like to know if we did any probing in our public consultation and surveying on hosts who currently do short-term rentals and use their suites at other times for family purposes, if they would actually be willing to move from not doing short-term rentals and go to long-term rentals, if we've probed that at all in any of the survey work. I also want to know if we consulted with the, not Airbnb, but the B&B operators, because we're changing the regime, the regulatory regime for them. We're lumping them now into this. So I want to know what consultation we did. Did we sit down with operators in the B&B industry around this? And just to follow up on Councillor DeGenova's questioning, I have some specific ones around Airbnb and the other platforms. Very specifically, are they willing to collect the voluntary transaction fee? I don't know if they are or they aren't, but I'd like to know that. And secondly, will the platforms require the listing of a Vancouver business license? And I'm out of time. But
okay, that's your time. So those responses
they can come at public hearing.
come at public hearing. Okay.
I'm fine if they do. Yeah. Thank
you. Sure.
Clarify just the last two, and then maybe the public, the host piece. So the transaction fee, the two hosts that we've talked to have said that they are willing to collect the transaction fee. The bed and breakfast operators, we did consult, especially in phase one. We're actually making it easier for them to run their business with this. So, and then probing with the host, we had a meeting that Airbnb helped to organize with hosts to talk specifically about the secondary suites. And then I forget the second to last question. Oh, and will the hosts require the license on the listing? They do that in other cities, and they've said that they would be willing to do that here.
I will send you these in written form as well. Thanks.
Okay, Councillor Reimer is next.
Thanks, Mayor Robertson. Lots of questions. Most of these I don't necessarily need answers for today, but would be looking for them at public hearing. The first was regarding why a city would require a renter to have permission, and my sort of concern here is that if part of the rationale for allowing renters to rent out their suite when they're not there is to allow them to make money to increase affordability, the asymmetry that is inherent in that an owner can rent out at any time, whereas a renter has to go to an owner for permission, it's much less likely that they have access to that income. So I'm curious as to why that provision exists, and in any event, it would be, in my opinion, an issue for the RTV and the renter and the landlord, not the city.
In talking to both renters and owners, but especially owners, it's about holding the owners responsible for their property, for nuisance, for neighborhood considerations. It's also about the owner's property, and the current terms that renters subscribe to include all kinds of requirements, and it seemed like a fair request. If the short-term renter is not going to be there, a lot of times owners interview renters, they want to know who's coming and going, and so it's out of respect for the property owner, whose property will have people coming and going other than the long-term renter, and especially if the long-term renter is not there.
Okay, that's interesting. It's not surprising to hear that it's out of respect for the owner, because it seems out of disrespect to the renter, but I appreciate the position there. Could you, on the advocacy pieces, you have a number of taxation advocacy. Given that only 7% of rentals are registered, it would seem like there's an opportunity there to advocate to the province to ask them to help us assist in registering the other 93%, because of course they have all the data that we would need to be able to find those rentals. So
only 7% of secondary suites.
Right, sorry.
They're not all rentals.
But they would have that data through lease agreements, through RTB complaints, through eviction. I mean, there's a number of ways that they collect the data that would be helpful for us. Sure.
So the secondary suite data is actually a bit of a mess, and it's kind of scattered in a lot of different places, and depending on the source that you look at, it varies. So the census is different than some, say, tax data versus what the province has versus what we've collected. So part of the secondary suite projects, the separate projects that we were talking about around expanding the number of suites and getting more suites into compliance, we'll be exploring more of that, of how we can actually create incentives for compliance, gather better information and data from the province, from the census, from the city, and better align that data, how to have a better understanding of the actual stock and how it's being used. So there's a huge opportunity for that, whether it's through here or that project.
Right, and I appreciate it's not really a matter for public hearing, although part of the overall report. On page 8 of the report, it talks about the potential of adding a number of suites. You've done a good calculation there about how many suites could be added. When you talk about potential, it'd be interesting to understand the mechanism. I understand the mechanism that you're proposing to stop it from being a short-term rental. What mechanism there would be to have it added to rental? Because just because it's not short-term rental, it doesn't follow that it's therefore long-term rental.
Yep, fair enough. It's an estimate based on what we think could free up and therefore be available for long-term renters. Whether a homeowner would choose to do that is to be confirmed. So what we anticipate is that could contribute around 1,000 units to the long-term rental market. But the owner behavior, we don't know what the uptake of that would be.
Okay, and last question, I'm guessing it's a fairly large question, so I appreciate that you may not have the answer at your fingertips. It's informed by a couple of things. One is that this main concern around impact on renters has 4 main criteria that we're evaluating. Is this increasing availability of rental stock? Is it increasing affordability of rental stock? Because those may be 2 different things. Is it increasing security of tenure? And is it increasing safety? Or what is the impact? Is it increasing, decreasing, or neutral? Mm-hmm. Given that there's a number of jurisdictions that have regulated already, I'd be curious to know what they've learned about those 4 questions and what maybe we can extrapolate to this proposal.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. There's a lot of emerging research on this, but not a lot of concrete or developed research. So the latest research we've seen is that there have been a number of papers published just even the past few months that show that short-term rentals have had increasing pressures on rents and availability of housing, particularly in high interest areas. So like there was one in Los Angeles and Venice Beach, for example, they demonstrated a direct impact to upward pressure on rents due to short-term rentals and the stock. And we've seen that in other cities as well, which you can see in the report. I think What we have talked about as part of the implementation is actually putting metrics in place from the beginning. It's part of our implementation plan to look at availability, affordability, safe, security, tenure, nuisance, all of those things. Kind of baseline them now and then evaluate them over the course of the first year to see how they're impacted. I think affordability, I don't know that this program will have a huge impact on the overall affordability of the market. I think it will be one of many levers. It's more about availability and not further increasing upward pressure on rents and trying to actually help to bring them down. But it's a little bit more about creating more available stock that's affordable for long-term renters.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Reimer. Councillor Ball.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for all the work and all the stats. It's very helpful. I just have a couple of questions. The first one is about on page 19, it does mention something that is, I've been asked about, all STIR units shall have a maximum occupancy of 2 adults per sleeping room. And a number of people have asked me, does that include children, or are that many people rent STIRs because they're traveling with their children, and they wanted to know whether they could continue to do that under this regime. So I didn't have the answer.
Thank you for the question. So we are proposing, 2 adults and not commenting on the children, and that's aligned with building code requirements.
Right. So they could not have their children with them. They would have to be in another room.
They could. It's a maximum of 2 adults.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's helpful because people rent their rec rooms, which are just large rooms, and have enough sleeping beds in there to accommodate families. So that's why I wanted to clarify that. The other questions that have come to me is from hospital patients who have been using secondary suites that were originally built for the children of the family. They're gone now, and now around our hospitals, those are being made available to patients who have to come in for longer periods of time, but not 30 days. And would it be impossible now for those hospital patients to be able to use those secondary suites, which are in homes that people actually live in? Would they still be able to do that, was the question that came to me.
So under the proposed framework, the use of private or shared rooms within the home would still be available to folks like that who are coming for hospital treatment to still use that sort of space within a home with the appropriate licensing. If it is a separate dwelling unit as a secondary suite, it would need to be occupied by a principal resident to obtain a business license to conduct the short-term rental.
So even if the people live upstairs, they can't use their rec room or secondary suite for that purpose, then that's what you're saying.
If it's a rec room, so if it's another private shared space within the home, and that home is the principal residence for those owners, that they can short-term rent their basement rec room as an area for short-term accommodation.
Okay, that came in as a real concern for the areas around the hospital. And the same for the universities. Parents bring their students to look at various universities, and they go through all kinds of entry exercises, and they may be there for 3 or 4 days or a week looking at a university, deciding where to go, and they come as a family, and that's one of the reasons they want to rent a residence or an entire suite. Is that still possible? Would that still be possible?
So it'd be a similar situation to the hospital scenario. The other scenario is that an entire unit, as long as it's a principal residence, can be rented out. So if you were to be going on holidays for 2 or 3 weeks and you decided you wanted to make your entire home available for a situation like that, for a family who might be transitioning to university, that is possible. You could put that unit on the market and short-term rent it for those 2 to 3 weeks to accommodate a scenario like that.
And the question that came was people who are living in their house want to make the suite that was available for their child, and they're not there anymore. Can they make that suite available for those purposes?
Right. So that suite, again, if it met the test of being a legal dwelling unit and a principal residence, it could be offered on the short-term rental market. So in that scenario, you would need a long-term renter to be the primary resident of that basement, of that secondary suite, and they then could conduct short-term rentals.
Now, if again, the question keeps coming back because it's people talking about their children. Their children use the secondary suite. They go away to university. They want to make the suite available for other students coming in who are seeing whether they want to go to UBC or to Langara or to one of our other universities, Simon Fraser. So what is the situation there for that suite, which is the child's ordinary living space, but they're off at university? Can this space be used?
Right. Well, I mean, often students are looking for what might be considered a short-term rental, but is actually more than 30 days. So they may need accommodations for a semester, which is 4 months, and that is more than the 30-day test for a long-term rental. So a suite like that could be offered on the long-term rental market to a student for a semester as accommodations.
But not available in terms of families being able to come and choose universities with their children. Not in that sense.
Right. It would have to fall into the scenario again of being a principal residence.
Right. So we're, just so that I get this really clear, so we're removing the option for parents to be able to do this and for children and for patients to be able to use secondary suites that are in homes that people live in. It's their home. They live in it, but they cannot rent out those suites to be used for these purposes from now on, or as soon as this is rolled out.
Yeah, so long as it's external to their principal residence and as the owner, then it is not eligible unless you have someone occupying it as a principal residence.
Okay, that's your time, Councillor Ball.
Thank you
You're
very
well
much.
over.
I just wanted to check one technical.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
And Councillor Jang is next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I have a couple questions that you can bring back at time of public hearing. I was kind of intrigued by your answer to Councillor Stevenson about the stories about evictions. And, you know, at City Hall, we hear lots of stories, we hear lots of things, but as you said, not a lot of data. And I was wondering if you can, if possible, bring some information back on the actual evictions or how you would propose to collect that data or something along those lines, because it's hearsay at the moment. And I would just like to get a little more thought around that. I think it's important because this is the purpose for doing this, right? Secondly, I've just been on the Airbnb site for fun. I've looked at Vancouver again. And well, let me start. I looked at Tokyo, for example, and we see lots of listings, for example, of whole houses and apartments going up on Airbnb. And I know my friends there are having complaints about that issues. I noticed on the Vancouver site, when I looked about a month ago, far fewer laneway houses being listed at Airbnb, like we've seen it fewer. Maybe they're being rented and not available right now, but they're not there. But I would like some information actually on, because I know since the discussion about short-term rentals was coming up, has that actually had an impact and started to drop off some of those listings, like the laneway houses, which were originally designed for long-term rentals. And if you have any data on if there are fewer laneways, those laneways that are no longer on Airbnb or short-term rentals, have they actually been converted into long-term rentals? I just want to get a sense of if it actually is creating a little more supply in the market. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Jang. Councillor Deal.
Yes, thanks very much. Just following up on some of Councillor Ball's questions, there are an endless number of scenarios that we can come up with, and I think that as we prepare to go to public hearing, I think it would be really useful at the public hearing if you prepare a few of the ones we've heard more often to make sure that we can answer those questions, because there are a lot of concerns. We've heard them. I think all of us here have had various meetings and heard from people. The student who's there during the year, what do you do with it during the summer? The person who lives in one city and works in another, it's fine if this is their primary residence, but what if they work in Vancouver and live somewhere else and have a different primary and are here during the week? Does that up to 30 days? You know, how that all works out. So if you could take some of because I was looking through the report and I've seen PowerPoints and we've talked about this, but just find 2 or 3 of those scenarios that we know are most likely. The person who's in town short-term to work and we're clear on the 30 days, but maybe just give us a couple of those scenarios at the public hearing, because we could talk individual potential scenarios forever and not be able to answer them all, or you can probably answer them all clearly, but if we can just come up with a couple of categories of those kinds of concerns, which are real concerns, so that we know very clearly yes or no on this or that. You've got a good list of yeses and nos, but as you know, there are an endless number of possible put-togethers of this and that and different factors that might lead to different concerns from various people. So that would just be great information to have during the public hearing. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Deal. Councillor Louis.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just further to the facts and versus stories component, and Ms. Krishna, you did say that there would be some baseline data collected in order to assess this program. Maybe you can just describe when you at the public hearing, not today, in more detail with some more exact numbers, and more specifically, like how many secondary suites are there, legal, unregistered, like how many of these long-term rental are actually in our city, so that we can determine what the movement is to short-term rental. Because the point was made, I think, earlier, that although this program that is being proposed may inhibit the conversion, but it doesn't actually create long-term rental units in our city as well. But the only way to know that is how many units we actually have. And maybe you can describe the methodology that you would go about describing where these units would be, how many there are. And I'm more interested also in the geographical distribution of both. In the report, you've done a good job, I think, of describing where the short-term rentals are, but where are the long-term rentals and what's its impact as a percentage, as the ability to pay comes into play as well, because different parts of our city, of course, can garner higher levels of rent rates, whether it be for long-term or short-term. And that's, of course, important for the lower income component, where the conversion or to short-term may be more impactful on the overall scope of things, given that the 7 guiding principles is the first one that's listed is, of course, the preservation of long-term rental in our city. And so I think that gives us the opportunity for us then in a year's time to really benchmark. But absent the data, we don't really know, we won't know how effective this program is and what adjustments are appropriately made. So, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Louis. I have just some brief questions, particularly on comparing what is proposed here for Vancouver to what's in place in other cities. And I appreciate all the work done by staff to research short-term rental regulations in many other jurisdictions, and the data that's provided in the report and so far to date. And I'm curious on the enforcement side, in terms of how cities with a comparable set of regulations are doing in the enforcement side. If that, when you looked at these regulations, did your recommendations basically flowing from what is working on all the way through the process, or most of these other cities still early days and everything's up in the air as to what's actually going to work? I'm curious what cities we've seen that have a good functioning system for regulation and enforcement, and particularly those that have the rental housing crisis that we have, which is what's motivating us to even consider this.
So yes, we've learned, so it's kind of a yes to both of your questions. Yes, there are emerging things that we're learning, and cities are changing. But we've seen, for example, San Francisco came out of the gate with a very strong enforcement approach. They hired, I think, almost like 11 FTEs in total to focus on enforcement. So they spent an enormous amount of public resources on trying to enforce their way out of short-term rentals, but they were only getting a 4% compliance. And so they've adjusted accordingly. We've seen that from a number of cities where they've been really strong on the enforcement side, and that they've learned it's just really difficult to enforce. Similarly with the night cap, a lot of the cities that put a night cap in place, which is trying to limit the number of nights that people can short-term rent space, it was nearly impossible for them to track that information. The data, because there are multiple platforms that we have to operate or work with, and not all of them are cooperative. So if we have more than 6 in Vancouver, only 2 have had conversations with us. So for us to get data from them, for us to have information around compliance, for them to agree to put business licensing, it's really complicated. And so we really are at their mercy to coordinate with us. So, it's between that and actually getting the information, it's really tough to enforce without really adjusting and being flexible and being more proactive and data oriented. And most of the cities that were on the strong and restrictive side of kind of the policy spectrum that we showed have started moving toward less of a strong enforcement approach and more strategic kind of data driven approach that we're proposing.
Okay, and is there a best in class right now that we're aspiring to model after?
I'm not sure that there's any one in particular. The staff can give more specifics on latest, but like London, Los Angeles, Toronto also are all kind of coming into where this kind of middle ground of where we are on the spectrum of things. Anything else?
I mean, again, all municipalities we're finding are adopting their policy and changing their policy as they learn more, and we're finding more coming to the middle. I'd say what we've proposed is a Vancouver-specific approach, taking the best of what we've learned from other cities, and is very closely aligned with what Toronto has proposed. So we do feel we're moving towards having the luxury of learning from what other municipalities have done and bringing forward a best solution for Vancouver with respect to the long-term rental market challenges.
So that would be our uniqueness. What differentiates us from other cities is our focus on the long-term rental protection, making sure that a number of these other cities made that a priority for their regulations.
Other cities have too, especially the ones that have been more restrictive are very concerned about that. So San Francisco being the example I gave before. Right. It also depends on the housing stock and type. So we talked to Seattle, for example, and they don't have as many secondary suites as part of their rental market. And they also don't have the same pressures on their rental market in the same way that we are. And so they don't feel that the percentage of secondary suites in their housing stock is not as significant as it is in ours. So they're taking a slightly different approach to that because it's not as impactful for them.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. We'll look forward to the next steps. I've got Councillor Affleck. What's that? I think given there's a motion potentially in front of us momentarily to refer this to public hearing, there'll be lots of opportunities for more questions at the public hearing. Obviously, rounds of questions directly to staff and then to people who come out and speak, and then another round of questions to staff. So we've got lots more in front of us and a big agenda for today. So I'm going to go to Councillor Stevenson.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor. And I noted when staff was giving the presentation and saying that this was very complex and that you were learning as you go, that you would be back no matter in a year's time on this as well. So I would like to refer this to public hearing. Mr. Mayor, recommendations A, B, and C. Second, thank you. I think this is going to be a very, very lively and good public hearing with lots of input from the public, because there's a lot of interest both for those who are wanting to rent their space and those who are trying to find rental accommodation. So that's my motion.
Okay, motion's on the floor. Councillor DiGenova to the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would have appreciated another round of questions. I know all of us were at our 5 minutes, most of us were, and I would have appreciated some more clarity on that, especially considering the questions that I know that Mayor and Council has received from the public since your words to the press alongside our staff. For those reasons and the fact that it's not clear, I understand that staff reported back in October that they would be working closely with with a number of stakeholders, including Airbnb. I understand and I appreciate that you've had meetings with those groups. As Councillor Deal noted, there's many scenarios and situations that I'm sure, there's always someone who's going to fall outside of that. And considering there seems to also be in this report reference a cost attached to enforcement, and also a question that I wasn't able to ask. I would be able to ask it at public hearing, but I'd like some more clarity before we put people through the process of public hearing, would be the same question I asked with the empty homes tax, which is why I understood we could not go to prosecution, is we would need evidence that home was empty for a period of time. So I'm concerned at the cost to taxpayers here. I'd just like to perhaps have some of those questions answered before we refer this to public hearing. I know that there are a lot of miscommunications, and I appreciate staff trying their best to communicate that in advance of today's referral. However, I just don't feel that there's enough information here. Also considering, and Councillor Affleck had brought this up, if he hadn't, I was going to, we have seen a lot of staff time spent on enforcement of marijuana dispensaries, and I certainly haven't seen the number of marijuana dispensaries close down or comply with the city's regulations. And considering that, moving into a new type of regulations, I'd just like some more thorough information before we refer this to staff. So I want to be very clear that I'm not against a referral. I'm just not against, or I'm not supporting a referral at this time. So with more information back, I could have supported the referral today, but I won't be able to support the referral because I think that there are still many questions left unanswered. I've had emails from people who, as just this past week, they're concerned that now they're going to have to, take out the suite in their home and turn that into a portion of their home to be able to apply for the license to comply. And I think that goes against the whole purpose of the report, which is to make sure that we have as many secondary suites as we can and to rent them on the long-term rental market. So for those reasons, I won't be able to support the referral at this time, but I appreciate all of the information staff's provided to us, and I have a feeling the referral will still go through, and I look forward to asking all of my questions at public hearing. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I just lost the list there. My apologies. Councillor Reimer was next.
Yeah, the main purpose to deny a referral would be an egregious error in the process of the development of the material. Not one councillor in the last hour and a half asked a question related to the engagement process or concerns related to anyone not being able to access that engagement process. So I'd be hard pressed to use the one purpose we have in denying a referral as a rationale. I would say that we have had the report for several days now. If Councillor DiGenova, you emailed staff the questions that you were concerned about and they didn't answer.
Councillor DiGenova, do you have a point of order?
Yes, under 5.2 of the procedure bylaw, which I've come to know quite well, if Councillor Reimer would prefer to apply for a staff position instead of continuing to berate me, I did actually ask a process question. Perhaps she was out of the room.
I didn't hear any berating going on. I heard Councillor
She told me
Reimer.
what I should do, Mr. Mayor, as she often does. If she could keep her comments and opinions to her own, that would be...
Okay, that's it's not a point of order. I just heard clarification of why the process with referral and then an interruptions. Councillor Reimer?
Yeah, I was halfway through a question. Perhaps I didn't inflect that into my voice enough. If Councillor DiGenova did in fact email staff questions that they were unable to answer, that would be useful for me to know because I would consider that an egregious error in process that she wasn't able to get the information prior to this referral. But if that didn't happen, I don't see any reason to delay referral because the main reason we don't have a lengthy period between a report coming to council for referral and referral is to avoid an apprehension of bias. And I dare say some of the comments made by previous speakers do give a perception of an apprehension of bias, and I would hate to prolong the opportunity for that for all of us. So if Councillor DiGenova had additional information about questions that went unanswered, I would be happy to entertain that as a reason for voting to not refer, but in the absence of that, I think we're just at the point where we would normally, in any other process, refer.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Affleck?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's definitely a challenge, Councillor Reimer, to not refer it, but I will also not refer this report. I will keep an open mind, absolutely, in the public hearing if it passes today, the referral. I think that Councillor Stevenson in his opening said that the public hearing will certainly have a very lively public, be a very lively public hearing. I think what he's inferring is that potentially meaning that there'll be a lot of people coming here, potentially opposed. That is not ideal in the chamber to put.
Councillor Stevenson?
I will retract that. I was making an assumption. I know where you're going with this, Councillor Stevenson. So
you're right. That's where I was going.
Okay.
However, I do believe that there is enough concern in the community that this report is not ready for prime time. I think we had a recent, the Kiefer project, which was clearly a challenging one at the public hearing process, and it might have been a better idea not to refer that one as an example where we feel the public are opposed to it and are concerned about aspects of it. From my point of view, there are several things that concern me regarding the report. I think, for example, there are the revenue forecasts, I think, are not accurate. I'm concerned that they are overly optimistic. I think that the fact that the issue has actually been leveling off, as the report states, so therefore we have to ask our question, what is the problem we are trying to solve here? I think that there are many people who have expressed concerns about home ownership rights and what are those rights, and the report doesn't properly reflect an understanding of what that means and how that might mean in policy creation by this council. So therefore, it's not a good idea to push policy through if we don't know the specific details on that. There are several simultaneous initiatives happening right now related to our rental programs and rental and short-term rental and long-term rental in the city. The most recent example is the empty homes tax, which was just implemented or just approved through the process. That tax has a likelihood of having an impact. There is a hope that it will. However, it was clear, and I had more questions, Mr. Mayor, but you didn't allow me to ask more questions, which is unfortunate. Because there was some clarity that I think could have helped. That the homeowner, the empty homes tax, perhaps, as staff have said, may impact the long-term rental pool. It will be difficult to actually ascertain that, but if that empty homes tax is successful, that should then perhaps provide an understanding and a clarity to how we might develop the policy on short-term rentals, if needed at all. I think there are parts of this report that are good, the business license program, creating some sort of infrastructure, but I think creating whole bureaucracy with staff, spending $500,000 a year, having staff police people who are renting their homes, their private homes, is a challenge, and I think that we have this other policy happening. We have a whole program of the housing reset, as it's referred to, that might bring back more information about how we can increase rental housing in this city, which is a priority of this council as well as the intention of this report. But until we have some more information about that, as well as the impact of the empty homes tax, it seems inappropriate that we should be putting another policy on top of other policies that are supposed to be doing that job. I worry that this report or these policies will drive the issue underground. I think we have heard from the suppliers like Airbnb and others that this will go into some dark web situation where people will not be clear on where they are renting. They will go to Craigslist. It's not so dark, but it'd be less clarity for us because there are other platforms. Government keeping up with technology is obviously challenging, and I worry that this policy will just drive people to other platforms that will be very, very hard for us to track. And of course, any concern that people might have regarding my potential bias, which I don't have in the public hearing process if it happens, I would like to also mention that the mayor did hold a press conference. I'm assuming that his fellow Vision councillors supported that press conference, would have clearly stated his support for this policy.
Louis, point of order.
Point of order, Mr. Mayor, is once again, Councillor Affleck, for the third time in his diatribe, has made assumptions about what other councillors or councillors are thinking. And again, he should be well aware of what the rules are. In fact, he corrected himself in this matter. And so perhaps another reminder to Councillor Affleck on making these types of assumptions about other councillors would be appropriate.
Thank you, Councillor Louie. I will be more cautious on that. I will state, though, that the mayor did hold a press conference himself and was very supportive.
Councillor Affleck, that was a city press conference, and I am the mayor of the city, along with Catherine Holm, who led this project to explain some of the details of the staff proposed report that was coming before council.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would suggest, though, that press conference clearly stated that this was a given, that this actually was going to happen. The report hadn't been made public at that point to anybody, and nobody had seen it, yet a press conference was held.
Councillor Jang, point of order.
Sit down, Councillor at the floor. Thank you. You know the rules. Once again, we have Councillor Affleck making assumptions about my vote, and I want to make it absolutely clear that I'm very open-minded, unlike his diatribe he's just given now. It's very clear where he stands. I don't even know if he should be voting on this item at all.
Councillor Jang, I'm just going to caution all councillors to refrain from ascribing motives to each other in general. That's not in our rules of procedure here, and I'll caution you all on that. We've heard too much of that. We need to proceed with considering the motion to refer this to public hearing. That's the business before council.
It's a statement of fact that the press conference was held before the report was made public, and that the way the presentation of that press conference, and you were there as the mayor, of course, was that this was happening. And as we know, this is a referral report. I don't generally see the mayor or staff having press conferences about referrals of public hearing documents related to buildings being built in our city, for example, anywhere. That does not happen. Why did it happen in this case? I would say that there is an implied bias in support of it. However, if you disagree, you can argue that and perhaps vote against it at the public hearing, and then that would prove otherwise. So I won't be supporting this. I've laid out why. I don't think the referral, as I've said, is ready for prime time. I think that we need to go back, let staff go back, look at some of the other data that we have. I think the data, as Councillor Reimer mentioned, and this was a question I have, there were information in the public process, in the survey, that it was conflicting. There was a dichotomy of what people were saying. They were saying they want more restrictions, but they want more places available for tourists. So I'm confused by that, and I think it's not the best way to present information that seems to be contradicting itself in the report itself. So I won't be supporting the referral because I think staff can take this away and work on it and then come back for another shot at having this for referral so that the public can have the best report that's possible from the City of Vancouver to come and speak to, and hopefully in favor, as opposed to what I might predict will be very opposed to in the fall, as it turns out. So don't be supporting. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Carr is next.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. And Mr. Mayor, I did email questions to staff indicating that they could answer them at the time of the public hearing, and I just emailed my final questions now before we make the decision. But it might help other councillors, perhaps Councillor Affleck and others who have said they have more questions, to know whether they can get those questions in, if they have to get those questions in before we vote, or if they can get them in over the next few days. I'm not sure about that process, but I think I'd like to see some clarification from my fellow councillors. This is
clarification in terms of questions?
Whether or not they can email more questions to staff that they did not have time to.
Yes, absolutely. People can that's been our practice for the almost 9 years that many of us have been here, where questions can be emailed to staff in advance of the public hearing. They could be asked, as a number were, during the referral consideration, and staff often begin public hearings by answering the questions that were forwarded by staff. By council to staff.
By councillors. Okay, that's great. So there is an opportunity there. And I also did, apropos of Councillor Reimer's comment, I did have some concerns about the breadth of public consultation and whether it was sufficient, but I did get those questions answered, particularly regarding the be operators. And in regards to other kinds of consultation, I asked questions that I believe I'll get responses back to at the time of public hearing, and obviously based on the responses I get back and the adequacy of those responses and the information that is provided, that will inform my decision. So so in that case, I am prepared to support this this referral. I do want to note that although we as councillors cannot communicate with the public, I think everybody probably knows that, but maybe not. So we cannot receive any information from any individual that is not equally at the same time shared with all of council. So people can write to, email to mayor and council, to all of us, all 10 of us, and well, we have one vacancy. That's fine, but we cannot have any independent meetings. But I believe that there could be communications still ongoing with staff as they verify information in preparation for the public hearing. So based on that, as I say, Mr. Mayor, I'm willing to support the referral.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Jang.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I'm very happy to support the referral to public hearing because we see all these people here, and I want to hear what they have to say. By not supporting referral to public hearing, you don't want to hear them. And I want to hear what they have to say. They've been emailing us, they've been calling us. We have the folks from Airbnb here. We have people who rent, people who have specific circumstances. I want to hear those stories. I also hear people who've been evicted, for example, and why we're doing this. I want to hear why, has there been problems with the housing supply? And that's what public hearing is for. And at that point, after we hear everything, if I think and I'm satisfied it's good enough, then I'll vote yes. But if I don't think it's good enough, I will vote no, just as we did on the Chinatown 105 Kiefer. So for anyone to assume that this is a done deal, as some of the councillors in this chambers have, they're absolutely wrong. And in fact, their own biases have shown through today. So I'm willing to sit and listen, and it may be a long and raucous one. It could go on for days and days and days. Been here 9 years, used to that, whether it was the casino, whether it was 105 Kiefer, whether it was the Rise development, what have you. I want to hear what these people have to say.
Councillor DiGenova, you have a point of order?
Under section 5.2 of the procedure bylaw, which by the way, Mr. Mayor, only I ever have to point out the section of the procedure bylaw, I would appreciate if you made all council.
You don't have to point that out unless I ask you what your point of order specifically refers to. But.
Okay, that's happened before. At least I've learned it well. Councillor Jang just said that some councillors have bias, and under 5.2, he is inferring that he does believe that, and that's a very serious accusation in the public hearing process. So unless he'd like to retract that, perhaps we'd have to deal with that before we move to referral.
Councillor Jang?
If it will mollify the councillor, then I'm happy to retract that portion. But my comments stand. I want to hear what everybody has to say, for, against, and otherwise. And as we have seen in public hearings before, if necessary, if we think that our staff have missed something, we can propose amendments and changes, as we have done before, or we can vote it down outright. But until I know from hearing everybody in this chambers and those who are watching on TV, those who have sent us letters, to actually come and stand at that podium, how the heck can I make a decision? So I'm happy to refer it. So let's get on with it. Let's get down to the root of it, and let's make it workable for everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Jang. And Councillor Reimer, did you have more?
I had a question for staff, which I'm thinking might solve this whole problem. There was an inference that if given more time, this report could be perfect, that we'd come and everybody would come and be very happy about the outcome. Could you, staff, give us, I know you've been doing, this is the second round of consultation, it's been quite an involved process for you. If we were to not refer today and send it back to you, do you feel that we could find a perfect or near perfect solution given your direct engagement with the public on this? Well, the test that was put out by Councillor Affleck was, I believe he said perfect, but I'm guessing he meant near perfect.
most policies are far from perfect. I think that we're really trying to get as close as we can out of the gate, in acknowledging that there are such a large volume of short-term rentals that we don't have any visibility, we don't have a legal framework, so we're trying to get started with a framework that works. We've done a lot of work around consultation and looking at other models, and I think part of what we were trying to show on the slide that showed the kind of the range of feedback is there are very extreme positions on this, depending on an individual, depending on an industry, and people's individual scenarios and experiences. And as Councillor Deal said, we can go through an infinite number of those. I think what we're trying to do is, I think what we're proposing tries to kind of at least strike a line in the sand now of what we think the balance is. I don't think that more time results in what we would come up with a different outcome. I don't think time was as much of a factor. I think there's more data and other details that we could provide, and these questions have been helpful, but I don't think that time was really a factor on where we've landed.
Which probably explains why you brought it to us at this point. Yeah, okay, well, I think per...
Councillor DeGenova, you have a point of order?
I understood that we weren't allowed a second round of questions to staff, but I understand that Councillor Reimer just asked another question of staff. So would that mean that all councillors are entitled to a second round of questions?
Councillor, you have 5 minutes to speak to the motion, and Councillor Reimer has used part of her time to ask a question of staff in her process of considering the motion.
So it is 5 minutes, because Councillor Affleck had 7, and I just wanted to make sure we're all making...
Thank you, Councillor DeGenova. I don't think you have a point of order there. I'm going to go to just a quick point for myself and then back to Councillor Stevenson for your closing comments as the mover. I will support a referral. I think it's... oh, Councillor Reimer, sorry, you were still in the...
It's all fine.
My apologies.
Councillor DeGenova has achieved her objective.
Did you want to finish your comments? So I'll then speak to it. I will be supporting the motion to refer this for that very basic reason that Councillor Jang articulated, that I want to hear from I want to hear from the public on this. There's been, and this goes back to April of 2016 when Council asked staff to study the issue and bring back a plan and options for pursuing a regulatory framework. Obviously, big concerns with an unregulated marketplace and loss of rental housing and legitimizing some important income for many people in Vancouver. Then it goes to October when we're meeting here as a committee and looking at a draft regulatory framework. So there's been a ton of work, and I appreciate the work that staff have done, the cooperation of Airbnb and Expedia, the two platforms that have been cooperative partners in this, and all of the update that we've had, input that we've had to date from residents here in Vancouver on all sides of the issue. So we've got a lot of information in front of us, but we do need to consider this the proposal that staff have put forward based on all of that research and all of that input. So I'm looking forward to the public hearing and seeing how residents of the city feel about this. And Councillor Stevenson.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor. I see I've had 47 seconds. Councillor Affleck had 7 minutes. I've got 6 minutes and 10 seconds to lay out my closing remarks.
Actually, no.
But I remind Councillor Affleck that this is prime time. We're in prime time, and that's why it is so important that we move this on to a public hearing, and I think it's going to be a lively, exciting, informative public hearing, and I trust all of us will come as unbiased as we possibly can and listen to the public and make a decision that's best for the city. So with that, that's my short, swift closing remarks.
Thank you very much for your brevity, Councillor Stevenson. And that means we are ready to vote on the motion to refer this to public hearing. Looks like we have all 10 votes in, 7 in favor and Ball, Affleck, and DeGenova are opposed. So the motion carries. We have referred this to public hearing. Again, thanks to staff and for all the work to date. We'll see you back here at public hearing, and just reminding councillors, as now we're into public hearing mode, we are not to be in meetings and discussing this matter other than through the formal public hearing process itself. And thanks to all those who've come today to take part in this. I expect we'll see many of you again at the public hearing. And we are on to our next report reference, and that is on Homeless Action Week grants for 2017. And Jennifer Hales is here from Community Services to present on the Homeless Action Week grants. Welcome.
Good morning. My name is Jennifer Hales. I'm a planner in the Homelessness Services Department, and we'll be presenting the staff recommendations for the allocation of this year's Homelessness Action Week grants. Homelessness involves severe human suffering, represents a loss of individual potential, and poses significant costs to our health, social services, and criminal justice systems. Homelessness Action Week provides the opportunity to engage residents in raising awareness about homelessness issues and in providing direct support to those experiencing homelessness. 2017 marks the 12th annual Homelessness Action Week campaign across Lower Mainland communities. It will take place from October 8th to 14th. Since 2009, the city has provided grants to local nonprofit community groups to host an event or run a project for Homelessness Action Week. The goals of Homelessness Action Week grants are to build the capacity of neighborhoods to raise awareness about and respond to issues of homelessness, to create innovative solutions to homelessness locally, to build healthy, safe, and inclusive communities in neighborhoods across the city, and to support existing and create new partnerships to address homelessness. Community groups are important partners in helping us achieve these outcomes. Homelessness Action Week grants enable the city to develop relationships with a range of nonprofit community groups. This year, almost $86,000 in grant requests was received from 29 local nonprofit societies, the largest overall grant request and the largest number of applications to date, indicating growing community interest in raising awareness about and creating local solutions to homelessness in our city. Staff recommends allocating $43,000 to fund 17 of these requests as outlined in Appendix A of the report, with the source of funds being the 2017 Community Services Operating Budget, Street Homelessness. Staff will report back to Council in early October with more detailed information on the events planned for Homelessness Action Week. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And Councillor Ball, did you have questions?
I had a comment about last year.
Okay.
Last year was extremely successful. I think staff collated a number of activities that were very informative and helpful to everyone in the neighborhood, was able to attend and learn something. And so I would like to say again this year there is a wide variety of activities mentioned and organizations, and I'm happy to support it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Jang?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Just one question. Looking at the goals of the 2017 grants, have they changed much from last year? I'm seeing a little more emphasis on building local capacity and connecting folks to treatment. Am I reading that wrong?
The overall goals, our 4 main goals, haven't changed since last year or the previous year. And the projects that we end up recommending for funding really are based on what has come from the community.
Okay,
so
it really is community driven.
It's very community driven. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I have no questions. I'm happy to move the recommendations.
Okay, recommendations moved and seconded. No more questions. Anyone wish to speak to the motion? I'll just say a big thanks to staff for all the work to put this together and make it bigger than better than ever. Thanks for bringing this forward, and we're ready for the question on Homeless Action Week grants. You did. I hadn't clicked it yet. Okay, one more go here. Okay, all 10 votes in favor, unanimous support. Thanks very much again. We'll look forward to all those great organizations doing good work out there. Thanks again. And we have completed item number, or report reference number 2. And we're on to number 3, which is supporting trans equality and an inclusive Vancouver. And hopefully we have Ann Nickerson close by here. Let's just wait a minute to see if she's close by. Is she on her way? Okay. So while we're waiting for Ann to come, why don't we move on and deal with the bylaws that we have before council. Next up in the agenda, and we have 8 bylaws on the agenda for consideration. Does any member wish to hold any of the bylaws for debate, separate vote, or for conflict of interest? And I will say for bylaws 1, 2, and 7, council members who are not in attendance at the related meetings, who have not previously advised they reviewed the proceedings, may only vote on the bylaws if they now confirm they reviewed the proceedings, which includes viewing the related video clips. With bylaw number 1, that's a public hearing enactment bylaw from a hearing held September 16th, 2014, and on June 27th, Councillor Jang advised that he reviewed the proceedings and can vote on this enactment. Councillor DeGenova, you were not on council at the time of the public hearing. Have you reviewed the proceedings, and will you be voting on the enactment?
I was not on council and I will not be voting.
Thank you. Bylaw 2 is a public hearing enactment bylaw from the hearing held December the 13th, 2016. Councillor Ball, you were absent from the public hearing. Have you reviewed the proceedings? Will you be voting on the enactment?
No, I will not. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bylaw 7 is a public hearing enactment bylaw from the hearing held May 17th, 2016, and Councillors Louis, Stevenson, and I were absent from that public hearing. Councillor Louis, have you reviewed the proceedings? Will you be voting on the enactment?
I was on council and I did review and I will be voting. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Stevenson?
Also, I will be voting. Did review.
That's a yes, and I will not be voting on that one. And that means we're ready for a motion to adopt bylaws 1 to 8. Councillor Deal, Councillor Jang seconds. Any discussion? All those in favor, the bylaws, any opposed? And that carries. So the approved bylaws can be viewed on the city's website. And we're going to track back to our third report reference, and that is supporting trans equality in an inclusive Vancouver. We have Ms. Nickerson here, Ann Nickerson, who's the director of our Equal Employment Opportunity Program. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Mayor and Council. My name is Ann Nickerson, and I'm the director of the Equal Employment Opportunity Program with the City of Vancouver. I'm here to provide a progress update on Council's motion supporting trans equality and an inclusive Vancouver. Sorry, I'm looking for the clicker. Sorry, I was told there's a different clicker this time around. Okay, so in the agenda this morning, very briefly, I'll be reviewing Council's motion that was passed in 2015, supporting trans equality and an inclusive Vancouver. I'll be reviewing the recommendations approved by Council from the staff report that was received by Council in 2016, 1 year later. I'll be providing a progress update on actions taken to date. I'll be highlighting some next steps that the implementation team will be taking, and I'll be inviting your questions. So the Council motion from July 2015 was as follows. It directed staff to consult with the LGBTQ Two-Spirit Advisory Committee and the Vancouver Park Board's Trans and Gender Variant Inclusion Steering Committee. It also directed staff to report back on exactly how the city could build on the work of the Vancouver Park Board and Vancouver Board of Education to make civic facilities, operations, and programs safe and inclusive spaces for trans and gender variant communities, including the following 5 pillars or categories: signage and literature, public spaces, human resource training and staff policies, programming, and collaborative public and community consultations. After that motion came forward and was passed, there was a breadth of consultation that took place, and that was with external subject matter experts and consultants of TransFocus. And there were consultations with a number of stakeholders, including city staff across city departments, Vancouver Park Board, Vancouver Board of Education, 3 of our advisory committees, and several service providers. As a result of that, a number of recommendations were made for the city's consideration, and these were in addition to the good work already taking place or underway at the city in relation to providing inclusion for these communities. The approved recommendations were contained in a report to Council July 2016, and they are as follows. To create an interdepartmental implementation team of staff to move forward with a trans, gender variant, and two-spirit inclusion action plan for the city. Next, to focus initially on the quick starts, which I'll be reviewing in the next slide, identified in the staff report. To report back annually on progress to date, which I'm doing here today. And to refer the report to the Vancouver Public Library Board and the Vancouver Police Board for review as part of their ongoing progressive work in this area. Moving on to the progress update. So right away, based on the pillar areas or themes, such as human resources, programs and services, and so on, a staff implementation team was formed of senior staff from across departments, and we started meeting in the fall of 2016. Of the quick starts, you'll see there the quick starts that Council directed staff to initially focus on. These were quick starts identified in the July 2016 staff report approved by Council, and then they are to be implemented by the end of this year. So you'll see the quick start on the left-hand side and the status on the right. So we're doing very well. We are well underway with a couple of them and complete on 3 of them. So I'll walk through each. Update single washroom signage to reflect universal functions-based designation. And I have a graphic of that in the next slide. That is well underway. Examples completed include City Hall, Archives, Park Board Administration, Hillcrest, Templeton, Britannia, and there are several of others underway. We're working closely with REFM on that, and I have a detailed schedule from them for completion of city-owned buildings by the end of this year. Number 2, ensure staff resources to lead the implementation team and decide next steps, including associated budgets to carry out the work. We are complete on ensuring staff resources to lead the implementation team. And we are currently looking at those next steps, some of which are brought to you here today, including whether any associated budgets are required to carry out that work. Number 3 is complete, provide training to corporate management team and all general managers at the City of Vancouver. With that one, we are also complete. And 4, develop a checklist for inclusion in City of Vancouver event protocols. This as well has been completed. And number 5, update grants priorities to reflect inclusion. This has gone through all grant streams, including social policy, cultural services, and housing, and this is also complete. So a sample of the washroom signage. And I need to note here that this was very much developed in consultation with our LGBTQ Two-Spirited Advisory Committee, as well as the Parks Transgender Variant Inclusion Steering Committee. And really the advice was to move away from the binary male-female icons to move towards functions-based icons and designation. So if there's a baby change table, for example, in the washroom, it will show a baby on the slider, an icon of that. With these, you'll see that men and women are still on the signs for those that are multi-stall. And the second important item that was added is trans people welcome. And again, this was upon advice taken at the time from our advisory committees, who we work very closely with. The one on the right you'll see there is for a multi-stall washroom, so it has neither male or female. And as I said, you will see these wayfinding signs, for example, and signage on the doors at City Hall. I did want to note that there have been some additional actions above and beyond the quick starts that have been taken to date. So with public spaces, facilities, and signage, there are a set of inclusion guidelines that have been applied to planning of all new city-owned facilities and renovations to existing buildings. So that is well in place. Within human resources, the human rights and harassment policy was updated to include gender identity or expression. And that, of course, was changed when the BC government made that change to the BC Human Rights Code. We've also undertaken further staff training sessions. So, for example, all staff within human resources has been trained. We've added new scenarios to our in-class training and online. And we've also delivered a number of awareness sessions. For example, when the signage was being implemented in City Hall, we ensured that places like security services and building services, those staff who may be asked questions by the public knew why the changes were being made and how to respond to those questions or concerns if they came forward from the public. I can say anecdotally that I know of one concern or question from a member of the public in relation to City Hall signage. I've found the staff and public to be generally very, very welcoming of the signage, and you'll see that later on by one of the comments that the Vancouver Public Library has received. As well, there have been within communications and data, their writing guide has been updated to include gender-neutral language. In terms of next steps, what we're looking forward to with our intentional work through to the end of 2018, I'll outline that now. So under public space, facilities, and signage, they will be looking to add new appendix notes in the building bylaw to provide guidance to industry on gender-neutral washrooms. That is expected to go forward in a report to Council in October, and they will be in the building bylaw as of January. They are also will be sharing as part of that, adding them to the building bylaw to share those best practices at meetings with AIBC and APEG as well. Programs and services would be to determine partnership opportunities, and housing would lead this with BC Housing, BC Nonprofit Housing Association, and Transcare BC on joint training opportunities for their staff. In terms of human resources and communications and data, human resources, we are looking to add online resources to support trans employees or transgender employees here at work. These would also be supportive resources for their managers. So for example, if an employee was undergoing a change, including a physical change, those would help to support both the employees and the managers. We will be continuing, of course, our staff training and including identification of online learning options. One of those options is to include it within our Respectful Workplace training module, which is online, and that could easily be added there. I will say that staff training, we are making it a priority to look at staff training in those city buildings where new signage is anticipated or underway. It is important to ensure that that awareness is provided to staff, if possible, prior to the signage going in there. And to date, we have been able to do that working closely with RAFM. We're also looking to include election staff in this training as well. Communications and data would be to continue to evolve the question on gender as needed on public engagement surveys. This, as you know, transgender, variant, and two-spirit inclusion is an evolving field, and so we have to keep abreast of best practices and hear from the community and our advisory committees for their advice. As well, outreach to transgender, variant, and two-spirit community agencies to sign up for Talk Vancouver and increase the diversity of that pool we have there. And lastly, community consultation and public partnerships is to update the list of stakeholder contacts to include transgender groups on a more purposeful scale, to develop resources as well to support inclusivity in public engagement planning. And I will say that how these were each selected out of the recommendations overall put forward by the consultant report, we felt it important that they needed to align with those 5 broad pillars or these headers we have here. We wanted to ensure they were in the city's mandate or jurisdiction. We also looked for what we could connect with and leverage to in terms of existing priorities. Ease of implementation was also looked at, and also if it could be within our current resourcing. A quick update here on Vancouver Public Library. One of the recommendations in the staff report that Council approved was to refer the report to the Vancouver Public Library Board and the Vancouver Police Department Board for their review. They have reviewed the report and are continuing existing work on their part. Both are undergoing staff training. That's quite extensive for both organizations. They are undergoing changing their washroom signage as well. And the Vancouver Public Library has been doing related public events and awareness. And on the police department side, they have added a permanent LGBTQ two-spirit liaison officer. At the bottom there, you'll see one of the quotes that they've received as a positive comment from the public. In closing, I would like to say that I will be back next year to provide another progress update. And as well, in closing, I would like to give my thanks to members of the implementation team and the support of their senior leaders, including my own, for prioritizing this strategy and their ongoing important actions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the report and the update on all that implementation and all the great work done. It's really fantastic work. got a few councillors here. We are at our noon time, so we first need a motion to extend to complete the business of the council agenda. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. And just making sure council is okay if we finish up this item, that we have everyone here in chambers and recess for lunch, and we'd come back then to complete the agenda this afternoon following the lunch and in-camera break. It looks like we're all okay with that, so we'll go to Councillor Stevenson first.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor, and thanks very much for this report. I love the top. That looks very colorful.
Thank you.
Match my socks. Truly. And also, I'd like to thank the implementation team as well. It's really been quite amazing, the progress that's been made already, and the quick starts and the progress on both is quite something. And then obviously many people are talking about this because it's so visible and seen. This is just a report for information. So, oh, very nice socks, Councillor Louis. Very nice. I don't know what I was wearing socks. The one area that I have some concerns and wanted to know how that might be dealt with is that a lot of new immigrants to Canada and to Vancouver are not used to the progress that we've made in this area. And I'm wondering, has there been any thought as to how to directly deal with that population? Because they really, at least I've had some discussions with people, and they're quite taken aback when they see the signs. They don't know what they mean, and they haven't encountered this in countries that they have come from.
Yeah, the education and awareness piece is a large one. And I think, you know, there's a number of ways to tackle it. And so as an example, I know the library, when they implemented their signage, they chose to keep the binary figures because they felt that they do get quite a few new immigrants who know those icons well and will follow them. So they felt in their journey that was one step they could make. In terms of the education itself, it's a good question. I know that with under programs and services, social policy is looking to determine partnership opportunities going forward, to look at providing education at least to staff in some of those areas where new immigrants and refugees, for example, childcare, where they would come. On a broader focus, you know, we work closely with the Immigrant Employment Council of BC and others. So perhaps there's more we could be doing there to make some inroads as to, we're very open to sharing our resources. So I've had other municipalities call me as an example, and we could certainly share what we are sharing with our staff and others as an example to help them, because getting that word out and that education out, I think, starts sometimes with ensuring those staff are supportive and understanding of it, and then can communicate that on to their clients in the nonprofit organizations.
Yeah, I think that's the key, is the staff to begin with, obviously. And this is further steps. I mean, it's quite amazing how far we've come already, and as a result of that, you start to think about, well, what are the next steps? Mr. Mayor, this is a report for information, so there's no need for a motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Stevenson.
Thank you, Councillor Stevenson. Councillor Ball.
Yes, and thank you very much for the report and for the staff's continuing work on human rights in our city. And I think that Councillor Stevenson's suggestion is wonderful, to be able to clarify what the human rights are here in the city, I think could be very helpful to lots of people, whether they're immigrants or not, and make a difference to how they treat others. So I appreciate that suggestion. I just have a couple of questions. So the first one is about training. The training that's mentioned that goes to the general manager and staff, who provided that training? Is it in-house training, or is it, do we hire people with lived experience, or what's the process there? Then I have a question following that.
Okay, thank you for that. Yes, we have hired Transfocus, so Drew Dennis and Kai Scott, and they have lived experience. They're subject matter experts, and they provided the training to corporate management team, as well as our general managers. And in terms of sessions going forward, I'm just right now with Drew Dennis at Transfocus setting another one up for the fall for our staff. In terms of the awareness sessions that we've been able to do, because there are so many of them, as the signage is rolling out right now, one of my staff who is very familiar with this work, Parker Johnson, is undertaking those shorter awareness sessions, but for the longer ones, the sort of 2 to 3 hours, then yes, we've been using Transfocus.
Great. So we do have people with lived experience.
Yes.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you.
Yes.
The other question was, we mentioned going out further into the city with training, and are we going into the library and to VPD, or do they have their own processes going on at the moment?
Yeah, I know Vancouver Public Library, and they regularly are invited and come to our implementation team meetings, so we can ensure that we're liaising and learning from one another in doing the work. And they also use Transfocus for their training as well. VPD, they have rolled out a significant amount of training. I know I'm not sure who their provider is, but I could certainly look into that. But I know that their training, I attended, for example, their Indigenous awareness training. That was provided by Indigenous trainers and speakers. And I know their training is always very, very good. So I haven't attended that one, but I know they're certainly rolling it out throughout the service.
That's excellent, because we have had reports of people who are transgender not wanting to call the police or call fire because they're afraid of calling them. So it's great to hear that those barriers can be broken down through this kind of training, and letting people know that this training has happened, I think will mean a lot to a lot of people.
And they do have, Councillor Ball, they do have within their Diversity and Aboriginal Relations Unit, they do have a designated LGBTQ Two-Spirit officer now, Dale Queering, and he's very familiar with the work, very well known in the community, and he would be involved as well in oversight of that.
That's great. I had one other quick question, which is about, we mentioned possible partnerships like with BC Housing. Would that be with an aim to being able to provide housing for the LGBT community who maybe have poverty or issues of violence? Is that where we're going with BC Housing? Is that the kind of...
Right now, what we're looking at in terms of incremental steps is we're looking at determining partnership for training opportunities with them.
Okay.
Certainly one of the longer-term recommendations in the consultant report last July was to consider looking at housing specific to this community, keeping in mind their very unique circumstances. That isn't an action at the moment, but it's certainly one that is there for consideration by housing, including community services.
That's great, because it has been successful in other cities, so it's great to know we're looking at that. So thank you very much. And again, thank you for the report.
You're welcome.
Okay, Councillor Reimer.
My question, actually, one of them follows directly up on the housing question. So I was looking at the original report from last year, and particularly recommendation 5A, conduct consultation on leveraging city land to pilot TGV, 2S specific supportive housing. So I know reset's sort of a the housing reset is a big piece, but curious to how this is integrated potentially into that next step.
I would say that's a piece that will be looked at. It's not identified right now in our next steps. However, those next steps are not, it doesn't just end there. I know there will be more work done beyond those next steps. And as you know, it is in the recommendations. So yes, those senior leaders within the department are aware of that recommendation. We do have people from that area on the implementation team from community services and others. So I can ensure our next meeting's coming up in about a month. I can ensure that that's raised there to ensure it's on their radar to look at how we can work together to move that forward.
Okay. Having been an informal supportive housing for trans youth because of the circumstances many of my child's friends were in, I can directly attest to the very high need for this, and I know every piece of data and research supports it. So the sooner we're moving forward on that, particularly if the housing reset's coming forward before the next month, which I think may be a possibility, it's something I would flag for inclusion there.
Okay.
And similarly, you know, sort of looking at the intersectionality issues that if you're Aboriginal and trans, if you're a sex worker and trans, like as these different mental health and addictions is the other big one. I feel though, because I segued off of Councillor Ball's questions, I failed to start by saying thank you for all the amazing work that's been done on this. As Councillor Stevenson noted, it has been a huge jump forward over the last year. And now I'm sort of diving into these gigantic items, so I apologize for skipping right over the thank you for the work already done. The only other questions I had, I had a few things. Annual report back, so that'll be every July, give or take, that's the plan. Okay, that's great. In the report, it references that, you know, the LGBTQ2+ committee would be the sort of equivalent of the steering committee at the park board, because we already have this committee. Are they engaged in a regular basis on the work? And if so, how does that work for them?
Yes, they are. I've been to, one of my staff's been to attending the Parks Transgender Variant Inclusion Steering Committee meetings on a regular basis, and I've attended, as Councillor Stevenson knows, some of the meetings with the LGBTQ Two-Spirit Inclusion Committee to ensure they're updated on the work and have input to that. One of the pieces that we recently met with one of the members on was around the gender question. Okay. And so gaining one of the members' expertise in that area. So that's an example of advice that we're seeking from them.
That's helpful. Last thing is more to flag for you, although you may have questions for me arising from it. Last night we had all of the chairs of all the advisory committees had their annual/biannual meeting, and they, as part of the learning component for this year's Council of Councils, very much wanted to focus it on trans and gender variant inclusion and whatever training staff are getting to have opportunity to access that. I know from that discussion also came out that many of them would like to think about how they can better incorporate trans, whether it's civic theaters and some of the building access issues and bathrooms, or Aboriginal and the policy matters. They would love to have that opportunity to connect with you on that.
Yeah, word's out already.
Okay,
I heard this morning, October 12th.
Good. I didn't want to be the first one to spring it on
yeah,
you. So
no, we'd be pleased to do that.
Great. Fantastic. Great.
Okay, thanks. And Councillor Carr.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Mayor, and thank you very much for all the work on this. I really appreciate the staff effort to really implement quick starts quickly. So my question, and I only have one, is related to quick start number 2, which is in progress, and it talks about whether or not we have sufficient, or ensure that we have sufficient staff resources and associated budgets. So my question is, I didn't hear anything about that. Do we have sufficient staff resources and budgets to move forward with the implementation of the rest of the recommendations?
I would say yes. I may defer to Andrew Niklicki the Chief Human Resource Officer to respond to this. What happened for myself is that priorities were rejigged and some work in my area was moved off elsewhere so that I could lead the implementation team. So I think, yes, staff resources are in place, and I feel that, yes, we've got the resources to lead it. In terms of identifying associated budgets, I think, and I believe I said this in the report itself, you know, as the work gets deeper, it becomes more complex, and you need to look at ways to integrate, to shift existing budgets within departments where you can, and then look at where that's not possible, where you need to ask for more resources. We're not at that point yet, but I think that is the piece that's underway, not so much the resources to lead the team, but what, if any, other associated budgets we will need outside of existing budget resources in departments.
Okay, that's good. I just want to make sure you're okay for the next year.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I appreciate it.
Okay, that's all the questions and feedback. Thanks again for all the great work done and expediting those quick starts. Really appreciate the work and look forward to the next steps. Thank you very much for being here today. And we are going to recess council now for a lunch break and some in-camera business, and we'll be back to complete the agenda. We need an hour, Sadie? Back at 1:15. Why don't we say 1:30? 1:30 we'll be back here to complete the council agenda. Thanks, everyone.